We're going to have to interrupt events in Beirut because we're going to go live now to the UN in New York, where they are taking up the situation in the Middle East. Let's listen in.
It's extremely serious and poses a grave threat to the stability of Lebanon, Israel, and the whole region. Mr. President, on the afternoon of 17 September, many communication devices, or pagers, primarily used by members of Hezbollah, exploded simultaneously across Lebanon. Similar explosions were also reported in Syria. The following day, a second wave of explosions, smaller in scale but more lethal, was reported throughout the same areas of Lebanon. This time, the devices involved were two-way handheld radios reportedly used by Hezbollah. Devices exploded in homes, cars, supermarkets, and streets. Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health stated that 37 people were killed, including 2 children, and more than 3,400 people were injured in the successive explosions. Medical professionals and hospitals are working around the clock to help the wounded. Lebanese society, old and young, have been in profound shock and panic. The Lebanese government has strongly denounced the attack, which it attributed to Israel. Caretaker Prime Minister Mikati said, and I quote, "It represented a serious violation of Lebanese sovereignty and a crime," end quote. In a speech on 19 September, Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said in response to the attacks that Israel exceeded all limits, laws, and red lines. And he vowed, and I quote, "to exact a heavy price and a fair punishment," end quote. He reiterated that the Lebanon front would only stop once the aggression on Gaza ended. In a letter to the President of the Security Council on 18 September, the Islamic Republic of Iran blamed Israel for the explosions. Noting that its ambassador to Lebanon was among those wounded, Iran stated that it, and I quote again, "reserves its right under international law to take required measures deemed necessary to respond to such a heinous crime and violation," end quote. To date, the government of Israel has made no official comment on these developments. Mr. President, since the explosions on 17 and 18 September, exchanges of fire across the blue line have continued, showing worrying signs of escalation. The exchanges include some of the heaviest bombardment of southern Lebanon since 8 October 2023. Israeli aircraft have conducted a high number of airstrikes and overflights, including breaking the sound barrier over Beirut on several occasions. In addition, we are receiving initial reports about an Israeli airstrike in the southern suburbs of Beirut hours ago, which Israel said targeted and killed a number of senior Hezbollah leaders. The Lebanese Health Ministry said at least 12 people were killed and over 60 injured in the strike. Meanwhile, heavy barrages of rocket, drone, artillery, and anti-tank missile fire from Lebanon have killed 2 IDF soldiers and wounded 10 Israelis. UNIFIL is monitoring the situation closely. On 16 September, Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, suggested that the center of gravity was moving north, including the transfer of military forces. Speaking of the onset of a, quote, "new phase of war," end quote, he suggested the only way left to ensure the return of Israel's northern communities to their homes was through military action. Reports from Israeli media indicate that Israel Defense Forces 98th Division was transferred from Gaza to the Northern Command, adding to concerns about the risk of further escalation on the horizon. From Lebanon, UN Special Coordinator Hennes Plekar has been in constant contact with all concerned actors, including Caretaker Prime Minister Mikati, Foreign Minister Mr. Bouhabib, Speaker of Parliament Nabi Berri, and their offices and other authorities. In her meetings, she has continued to push for a diplomatic solution and warned against further escalation. she continues to underscore that military advances would not restore stability or enable displaced civilians on both sides of the Blue Line to return home safely. She will travel to Israel early next week for consultations with relevant counterparts. Mr. President, in the current fragile regional context, the devastating war in Gaza continues. Nearly a year after the horrific atrocities committed by Hamas on 7 October, Israeli military operations, including bombardment from the air and land and armed exchanges with Hamas and other militants, continue across the Strip. The number of fatalities tragically keeps increasing. More than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, many of them children. At the same time, the indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other armed groups toward population centers in Israel also continues. I once again echo the words of the Secretary General. We need an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza. The risk to security and stability, not only in Lebanon, but also in the region, could not be clearer or graver. The Secretary General has already expressed his deep alarm over these events. I echo his sentiments and strongly urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint to avert any further escalation. They must abide by their obligations under international law concerning the protection of civilians. I also strongly urge member states with influence over the parties to leverage it now. As we approach a full year of near-daily exchanges of fire across the Blue Line and bloodshed in Gaza, too many lives have been lost, too many people have been displaced, and too many livelihoods have been destroyed. But if things continue as they are, we risk seeing a conflagration that could dwarf even the devastation and suffering witnessed so far. It's not too late to avoid such folly. There is still room for diplomacy, which must be used without delay. The Secretary General continues to urgently call on the parties to recommit to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and immediately return to a cessation of hostilities. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. De Carlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies. I'm appalled by the breadth and impact of the attacks on 17 and 18 September in Lebanon on civilians, where the explosion of pagers, two-way radios, and other electronic devices have reportedly killed at least 37 people, including 2 children, and injured more than 3,400 people in Lebanon alone, leaving many with permanent disabilities and healthcare facilities struggling to cope with the magnitude of the impact on people. These attacks represent a new development in warfare, where communication tools become weapons, simultaneously exploding across marketplaces, on street corners, and in homes as daily life unfolds. Authorities have reportedly dismantled unexploded devices in universities, banks, and hospitals. This has unleashed widespread fear, panic, and horror among people in Lebanon, already suffering in an increasingly volatile situation since October 2023 and crumbling under a severe and long-standing economic crisis. This cannot be the new normal. Mr. President, war has rules for each and every party to this and any other armed conflict. Armed force, that is, violence against other human beings, can only be used where necessary to achieve a valid military objective. In doing so, the fundamental distinction between civilian and military targets must be front and center. All feasible precautions must be taken to spare civilians. Attacks must remain proportional to the wider damage they inflict. persons not exercising a continuous combat function in an armed group can only be targeted when taking a direct part in hostilities. At their core, these rules have the paramount aim of effectively protecting civilians. International human rights law exists to protect the equality and dignity of every human being, even in times of war. Law exists to defend values central to our societies and to our world. Simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location, and their surroundings at the time of the attack, violates international human rights law and, as applicable, international humanitarian law. It is difficult to conceive how, in these circumstances, such attacks could possibly conform with the key principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack under international humanitarian law. If the attacker is unable to assess the compliance of the attack with binding rules of international law, notably the likely impact on civilians, then the attack should not be carried out. International humanitarian law prohibits the use of booby-trap devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. It is a war crime to commit violence intended to spread terror among civilians. I call again for an independent, thorough, and transparent investigation into the circumstances of these explosions. Those who ordered and carried out these attacks must be held to account. Let me be clear. This method of warfare may be new and unfamiliar, but international humanitarian and human rights law apply regardless and must be upheld. These attacks occurred amidst hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah, which since 8 October last year have caused civilian casualties on both sides. According to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, figures that were released in August, over 500 people have been killed, over 2,400 injured, and according to IOM, over 110,000 displaced in Lebanon. The government of Israel reported 48 people killed in Israel and over 63 people displaced in the context of these hostilities. The last 24 hours have seen intensified cross-border military action in Lebanon and Israel. This tragic situation cannot be seen in isolation. It is bound up with the war in Gaza, the spiraling violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Israel's continued occupation of Palestinian territory. The heightened risk of further atrocity crimes remains. As repeatedly stated, the humanitarian situation for 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza is catastrophic. Over 1,200 people were killed on 7 October in Israel. In Gaza, over 100 hostages are still held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Over 40,200 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed as a result of the intensive Israeli offensive, and over 95,500 injured in Gaza, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. I'm outraged by this inconceivable toll of human suffering. For the UN and other humanitarian responders, ongoing hostilities, access constraints, attacks on staff and facilities, and damaged infrastructures, along with the deteriorating security situation, including looting and frequent Israeli-issued evacuation orders, are key factors obstructing the delivery of sufficient life-saving aid across the Gaza Strip. Ending the war in Gaza and averting a full-blown regional conflict is an absolute and urgent priority. I call for an immediate ceasefire and for continuous humanitarian access to be ensured throughout the Strip. I urge the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. The arbitrary detention by Israel of thousands of Palestinians must end. The wider situation of illegality across the occupied Palestinian territory, deriving from Israel's policies and practices, as so clearly spelled out by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion in July, must be comprehensively addressed. Mr. President, Disrespect for international law is a matter of international peace and security, the core obligation of this Council, with implications beyond these countries and this region, beyond these countries and this region. States have constructed international human rights and humanitarian law precisely for moments like these, when life, dignity, and our very humanity are at risk. As such, states must not, cannot accept blatant disregard for international law, including binding decisions of the Security Council and orders of the International Court of Justice. They must not, cannot allow the hollowing out of international law and its protective core, neither in this nor in any other situation around the world. All states, particularly those with influence, must do everything they can to ensure full respect for international law. Just over 10 days ago, in my address to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, I urged the rejection of a new normal of endless, vicious military escalation and increasingly alarming, technologically advanced methods of warfare. The warnings from multiple actors against an all-out war in the region have been clear and consistent. It would benefit no one. Continuing on this path of inflamed war rhetoric on all sides and reckless military escalation only leads to further devastation. I urge Israel and Hezbollah to cease hostilities immediately. The specter of this region's past, the unending cycles of conflict, the human rights grievances and causes of which have been ignored and trampled on, is palpable and omnipresent. The complexity of this moment and the stakes for people everywhere demand much more from the international community to achieve an enduring peace. This crisis requires political courage and leadership. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Türk for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, I thank Mrs. Di Carlo and Mr. Turk for their briefing, and I acknowledge and welcome the presence of His Excellency Minister Abdullah Abu Habib among us in this meeting. My country has called for this urgent meeting in light of the alarming escalation in Lebanon on September 17 and 18. These tragic events have resulted in dozens of deaths and thousands of injuries following the remote detonation of small communication devices across the country. The perpetrator is well known. We strongly condemn this Israeli attack. Such actions represent a blatant violation of Lebanon's sovereignty, of the UN Charter, of the international law, and of Resolution 1701 and 2749. Algeria stands in full solidarity with Lebanon during these difficult times, and we extend our deepest condolences to the government and to the resilient people of Lebanon. And we commend the Lebanese authorities for their measured and responsible handling of this grave crisis, preventing further escalation. Mr. President, these acts of aggression amount to war crimes that deliberate and discriminate nature of these Israeli strikes has caused terror among civilians, with densely populated areas being targeted. This dangerous precedent turns civilian devices into bombs, threatening the safety of all and posing a significant threat. This precedent opens a dangerous Pandora box. What will happen if such unfamiliar tactics are replicated by terrorist groups? While the international community calls for desescalation, Israel pulls the region toward war, expanding hostilities from the Blue Line into the entire Lebanese territory. The Israeli officials have openly threatened to launch a large-scale war in Lebanon. These attacks were followed by statements, official statements, praising the so-called positive result. The airstrike against Beirut this morning are another proof that the Israeli occupying power is not at all interested in peace. So, do Israeli occupying authorities truly seek peace with their neighbors? Are they genuinely committed to implementing Resolution 2735? Are they really committed to a ceasefire in Gaza? Mr. President, the Security Council bears the solemn responsibility to uphold the principle enshrined in the UN Charter. The Security Council must enforce its resolution. Resolution 1701 must be fully implemented without bias, and the Israeli occupier aggressions must cease, and it must withdraw from all occupied Lebanese territories. Only by ending the occupation that we could pave the way for lasting peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et nous saluons la tenue d'une réunion suite aux développements extrêmement inquiétants au Liban et au-delà. Et je voudrais remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe
Under Secretary General Musdi Carlo and High Commissioner Turk for their statements that have very precisely detailed the events that have unfolded in recent days. I welcome the presence of the Minister and, of course, all colleagues in the chamber. Mr. President, Switzerland expresses its grave concern following the explosions of pagers and other electronic communication devices which occurred Tuesday and Wednesday.
Parmi les civils, y compris des enfants.
Okay, so you've just been hearing from representatives from the UN Security Council speaking at this special session that was called to deal with the recent hostilities in Lebanon and Israel, the attacks on Lebanon, the pager attacks and the walkie-talkie attacks, and the consequent strikes that have come over the last few hours. Several leaders condemning Israel's actions, particularly the pager attacks, what are thought to be Israel's actions, although Israel hasn't officially confirmed that. Some pretty strident criticism of Israel there. Let's go to UN correspondent Frank Uciardo, who is at UN headquarters. So we heard from a number of speakers there, Frank, and they were not pulling any punches, so to speak, as far as how they felt about what's unfolded in Lebanon over the last few days.
Well, let me tell you how we got here. Of course, we just heard from Algeria's UN ambassador, Benjama. He's the one that called for today's emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. The meeting was started off by the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, the political chief, that being Rosemary DiCarlo, who basically went through a timeline of events of the escalation of violence across the blue line. She talked about strikes and exchanges of fire that keep expanding in scope and intensity. And she said that it really has reached deeply into affecting the Lebanese and Israelis on both sides of the border. She said over 10,000 people apparently have been displaced in southern Lebanon. 10,000 have been displaced. That's what they're saying. We also heard from Volker Turk there, the UN High Commissioner, and he was talking about how the pager devices were actually implementing a war crime, he said, by using these type of electronic devices to spread fear. It is committing a war crime, according basically to the UN Charter. This meeting, we expect, will hear from about 21 speakers. We also hear that we'll be getting a speech from the Lebanese minister who is here and the Lebanese ambassador later on this hour. Back to you.
Once this meeting is concluded, Frank, what do we expect to happen from here on? We heard from the Algerian representative saying that Resolution 1701 must be enforced without delay. This is the resolution that calls for the full cessation of hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah.
Yes, well, this was something that the Security Council had adopted way early on, except that there are caveats in that resolution that were insisted upon by the United States that basically called for all hostages to be released before Israeli troops even move. And the U.S., of course, can't guarantee that's going to happen. But he's urging all members of the Security Council to try to use their influence with both sides here, the Israelis and Hezbollah, to de-escalate before it gets really out of hand. This is indeed an emergency meeting. It was never on the calendar today. And everybody's going to be airing their views from all 15 members of the Council, in addition to the Lebanese and the Israelis towards the end of the meeting. Back to you.
Frank, thanks very much. Frank Usiado, live for us at UN headquarters in New York. I'm now joined by Mahjoub Zuwairi. He is a professor of contemporary Middle East politics at Qatar University. Mahjoub, good to speak to you again. So I want to ask you, first of all, what is your take on events unfolding in the Middle East over the last few days?
Well, this is a reflection of what Netanyahu wants and the plan for last 2 decades. Netanyahu has designed his foreign policy in the region that Iran is the core business and all of what's so-called the arms of Iran are targeted. So in the last 20 years, that was his plan. He tried to move on from different direction. The 7th of October has triggered his plan and push him to achieve his goals. This doesn't mean that 7th of October the only thing, but 7th of October was sort of a justification to be more aggressive towards Iran and the alliance of Iran in the region. Netanyahu was very clear. He wants to end the Oslo agreements. He wants to normalize the situation of Israel with the neighboring country, regardless the situation of the Palestinians. He wants to end the whole, I would say, the legacy of being left since the Second World War, including the UNRWA, including the refugee issues. He wants to have a new page for the whole matter. Now what's happened the last 48 hours is just a continuation. The target now is Hezbollah, is a shift. He wants, he's desperate, Hazem, for a victory. He's looking for a victory. In Gaza, he's losing on the ground. He destroyed Gaza. He killed more than 40,000 people. But the reality, there is no victory. There is nothing he can present to his base in Israel, even to his allies in Washington. Still, the blame is there, even if we don't hear it in the media. I'm in the States now, and I can confirm to you, there is no one convinced that there is a victory achieved by Netanyahu on his war in Gaza. And now this is a continuation of this kind of, I would say, the loser feeling that killing more leaders of Hezbollah that could be a victory. No one knows if this will be the case or not.
Mahjoub, we've seen something of a shift in Israel's military strategy over the last few days. We heard from the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying that there's a couple of days ago saying that there's going to be a shift of priorities as more military resources are being drawn towards Lebanon and Hezbollah. What do you make of that, and why do you think that's happening now?
There are two reasons, Hazem, for that. Number one, there is no serious targets in Gaza left. I had, hours of discussion with people who are with a military background. All of them admit there is nothing left in Gaza to be considered as a military target. So now what has left is targeting individuals, or some people they assume they are affiliated to Hamas. That is one reason. The second reason is basically shifting the whole attention and seeking the victory, seeking something can be presented to the Israelis and presented even to the Americans, because the Americans administration asking them, tell me, what have you achieved? What happened in Gaza? Hamas is still strong. You failed to weaken Hamas, and now you are moving to the north. You know that Hezbollah is stronger than Hamas. So basically, the second reason is seeking for victory, seeking for achievement. So they assume by targeting individuals of Hezbollah, killing or the Beirut issue, and now targeting the Radwan elite, they think that by doing so they are achieving goals. These can be a short-term goal. There can be short-term achievements, but in reality, they are opening the gate of the hell before more developments to come. Because what if Hezbollah decided to react and basically changing the whole game and targeting civilians in Tel Aviv and other cities?
Okay.
How will be the situation in the world?
Okay. All right, Mahjoub, sorry to interrupt. We're going to go back to UN proceedings right now, where another U.S. representative is speaking now at the Security Council session.
Prior to Hamas's brutal terrorist attack, quiet had largely been maintained along the Blue Line for 18 years, since the adoption of Resolution 1701 in 2006. This stability was shattered on October 7 and 8, when Israel was attacked without provocation by non-state armed groups in Lebanon. And for the past 11 months, the people of Lebanon have suffered the devastating consequences of this conflict, which is not their own. More than 100,000 Lebanese civilians and more than 65,000 Israeli civilians have been displaced. Civilians on both sides of the Blue Line have seen their homes destroyed and their fields and orchards burned. Hezbollah, which receives extensive training, arms, and financing from Iran, took these actions in solidarity with Hamas, not for Lebanon or the Lebanese people. And for the past 11 months, Hezbollah has continued to bombard communities in northern Israel on a near daily basis, again, in support of Hamas and Iran's broader campaign to threaten Israel. Hezbollah's sustained attacks, presence along the Blue Line, and entrenchment in southern Lebanon also put Israeli and Lebanese civilians at risk. Israel has a right to defend itself against Hezbollah's attacks. No member of this council facing a terrorist organization on its border would tolerate daily rocket attacks on its territory and the displacement of tens of thousands of its people. We expect all parties will comply with international humanitarian law and take all reasonable steps to minimize harm to civilians, especially those in densely populated areas. Continued escalation of the violence across the blue line will not create the conditions for displaced Israeli and Lebanese civilians to return to their homes in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. Rather, the United States continues to believe a diplomatic resolution is the only way to create the conditions for displaced Lebanese and Israeli civilians to return to their homes with safety and security. And we will continue to pursue this goal. Iran, through its sustained supply of weapons and personnel to Hezbollah, in blatant disregard and defiance of the call for disarmament in resolutions 1559 and 1701, and in violation of the latter's legally binding arms embargo, appears to have a different agenda. Over many years, the United States has committed substantial resources to humanitarian efforts in Lebanon and supported independent institutions such as the Lebanese Armed Forces and Internal Security Forces. Equally significant, the Security Council has clearly and repeatedly expressed its desire to see the full authority of the Lebanese government extended throughout Lebanon's territory. And it has emphasized its strong support for the aspirations of the Lebanese people to live in peace, free from foreign meddling. Every member of this council has a responsibility to help Lebanon's people avoid further tragedy, to support diplomatic efforts that would help restore calm along the blue line, which again would enable civilians in southern Lebanon and northern Israel to return to their homes, and to also press Iran to cease its destabilizing and dangerous use of Hezbollah to undermine regional security in a way that puts the Lebanese people in danger. This is the path toward greater regional stability, and the United States will continue to do everything possible to support de-escalation and an enduring diplomatic solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢阿尔及利亚
Algeria for requesting this meeting and welcome the presence of Lebanese Foreign Minister Mr. Abdallah Bou Habib.
All right, so we've just been listening there to Robert Wood, the U.S. representative to the UN at this particular UN Security Council session. He is a deputy U.S. ambassador to the UN, condemning Hezbollah's actions in Israel and affirming Israel's right to defend itself. Let's go back to UN correspondent Frank Usiado with more on this. Frank.
But, you know, I think one of the things that Robert Wood, the Deputy UN Ambassador from the U.S., was trying to do was stress that the U.S. had nothing to do with the explosions in Lebanon. He then went after Iran for supplying weapons to Hezbollah, and he asked the Security Council to take responsibility for the welfare of the Lebanese people and ensure that they avert what he called any further tragedies. He said also that Hezbollah was working in solidarity with Iran. So clearly, most of his speech has been focused on putting the blame squarely on Iran for what's taken place in Lebanon. Back to you.
So, Frank, we're expected to hear from several more speakers as this UN security session goes on. We heard earlier from one of the representatives, the Algerian representative, saying that Resolution 1701 needs to be implemented. This is the one that calls for the complete cessation of hostilities in the region. What is the likelihood of that happening at this point, given given the U.S. support for Israel on so many of these things?
Well, you know, the funny part about it is that 1701 was also, you know, approved and adopted in cooperation with the U.S. mission here, but they also had language in that resolution, basically, that would not really allow it to be totally implemented, because it really requires that before anything happens with Israel pulling its troops completely out and stopping the violence and the fighting, there would have to be a complete hostage exchange first. All hostages from both sides, everybody, completely released and accounted for. Then they would ask Israel to withdraw. But you know, if it passed as prologue, the Security Council is not going to go beyond that resolution with any kind of enforcement action because of the U.S. veto. And clearly, there was no language in that resolution that said that if it basically wasn't adhered to by both sides, that there would be any kind of consequences. And that has been the problem with the UN Security Council over the years when it comes to the United States shielding Israel on any of the things that are going on in the Middle East. Back to you.
Frank, thanks very much for the moment. Frank Uciardo, live for us there at UN headquarters in New York. Let's talk now to Catherine Ravey, who is a legal advisor with Law for Palestine in The Hague. Thanks very much for being with us. So I'm not sure if you've been hearing some of these proceedings, but we did hear earlier from the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, Volker Turk, who was pretty strident in his condemnation of what's happened over the last few days in Lebanon. He said this cannot be the new normal, and he said that it was a war crime to spread terror among civilians, with these, specifically referring to these pager attacks that happened earlier in the week, and then the radio attacks, because there were bystanders there, there were innocent people there when it happened, a few children as well. So in that sense, this is a violation of humanitarian law. What's your take on that?
Yeah, he's absolutely correct. I mean, these attacks we have seen Israel commit and perpetuate in Gaza and the West Bank the last 11 months. This is the MO for Israel. We have seen indiscriminate attacks perpetuated time and time again. They've enjoyed tremendous impunity for such attacks. I mean, international law is clear in needing to ensure that your actions are proportionate and take into account civilian harm. And frankly, if this were to happen in any other part of the world, it would be considered a terrorist attack. And the diplomatic impunity that Israel has enjoyed shields it from that. I think Western media has certainly painted these attacks as something extravagant and creative, which is just horrific, considering they are a direct violation of international law.
So you say there that Israel is able to operate with impunity, and if this were to happen elsewhere, it would be a completely different story. Just explain for us why you think that is.
I think as we've seen the last 12 months in Gaza, the impunity that Israel has enjoyed, largely thanks to the United States, as the previous speaker had mentioned, shielding it at the UN Security Council, and also completely funded by the United States, has allowed Israel to continue its attack, continue to make blatant war crimes all over Gaza, the West Bank, and now Lebanon. I mean, if the Western states, if the international community is serious about upholding international law and a rules-based system, then they need to understand that Israel is actively undermining peace in the region, and arming Israel further is just escalating this violence and is really threatening the entire order of international law as we know it.
We have seen over the last few months, though, an unprecedented level of pushback against Israel on that front, as far as violations of international law and humanitarian law and so on, in that Israel has been taken to task in international courts. So, do you expect that to result in anything tangible?
I mean, I always hope. I do think we are seeing the accountability measures in place do what they can, but we have to remember that international law is a state-based system. Everything is at really the mercy of states, state cooperation and state compliance. And unfortunately, when it comes to Israel, we see some pretty powerful states backing their choices, also, in my opinion, for their own personal gain. So yes, we've seen the ICJ, we've seen the ICC come and act, but really those mechanisms can only be effective if the international community steps up and takes a lot of these decisions into action. You know, we have seen the UNGA recently come out with that resolution ordering Israel to end its occupation. Once again, I hope if the international community is serious about upholding that they will take greater actions, including a full arms embargo against Israel.
Appreciate your perspective, Catherine Raby, joining us there. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Let's cross over now to occupied East Jerusalem and speak to Yunus Demirolu. So, Yunus, what is the latest that you are hearing from there?
Well, just on these recent attacks on the southern in various parts of Lebanon, the Israeli army has claimed responsibility for these attacks, most notably for the airstrike in the southern suburbs of Beirut, in which the Israeli army claims it has killed several members of the Ridwan elite unit, several high-ranking senior officials, and most notably the killing of Ibrahim Akir, the alleged killing, of Ibrahim Akir. His killing has not been confirmed by Hezbollah thus far. But the Israelis, what they're saying is that Ibrahim Akil was complicit in these cross-border attacks, as well as he was planning to carry out an October 7th-esque attack into Israeli territory called occupied Galilee Heights. What the Israeli army is saying is that Ibrahim Akil was planning to carry out several incursions into Israeli territory, take hostages from Israeli citizens, attack Israeli settlements, and ultimately occupy the Galilee Heights. Now, we have received several statements from the Israeli ministers, most notably from Defense Minister Gallant, who has said that the sequence of our attacks will continue, and even in Beirut is the words that he used. So essentially declaring Beirut an active war zone. But it's important to note that the Israeli military has a tendency of using psychological warfare, especially thinking that both sides are not willing to escalate. Israel does not believe it can afford an all-out war in this moment. So the Israeli ministers and the military is definitely trying to push their upper hand in terms of psychology. I think this is apparent with what's happened in the past few days, with these pager bomb explosions having come back-to-back in 2 separate days. These sonic booms that are carried out by Israeli fighter jets, carrying a strong signal, a strong message to Lebanese and Hezbollah citizens, saying that, we can strike you at any time, basically. And then the day after, where they did carry out an attack, killing a high-ranking Hezbollah official and basically declaring Beirut a war zone in these statements. Now, as we speak, Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the 5th day in a row, has called for an emergency council meeting. We aren't expecting any statements after this meeting, but we will be sure to follow up on its actions from the time to come.
And it does seem, Yunus, that with these recent attacks on Lebanon and the announcement about the Israeli troop movements to the north, that the focus of Israel's attack now is further towards Lebanon, perhaps at the expense of Gaza. But the Israeli people are not going to forget about the hostages that are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. We saw those protests only last week. So what's the mood among the Israeli public over all of this then?
Yes, massive protests, back-to-back weekends, but we've also seen consistent protests during this week. Now, like you said, the uniting theme among these protests is to bring back the hostages and to promote, to finalize a ceasefire deal as the quickest and safest way to bring back these hostages. But from what we've seen and what we've talked to with the Israeli citizens, these protesters just last week, they understand that this is now, the situation is now just bigger than just the hostages. They're accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of putting the country's security at risk. His image of being Mr. Security has now been shattered. They've lost faith in the government, not only to bring back the hostages, but to ensure the security of this nation and the future, the security of the future of this nation as well. Now, we are expecting massive protests on Saturday as well, where these sentiments will be expressed even more so, and we'll be bringing you those latest updates on Saturday.
All right, for the moment, Yunus Demiroglu live for us there in occupied East Jerusalem. And that is your news hour. We're back with more news in a couple of minutes. Stay with us.